welcome to this conversation, or this invited conversation. My name is Josephine Greenbrook, and I'm the current chair of the Transnational Initiatives Committee of the SSSP. Our conversation today is a continuation of the three conversations that were previously recorded, and we now hope to expand on. With us today, we have Dr. Maisa Rekis, Dr. Alexandra Busiu, and Dr. Nina Vuola-Järvi. We are going to continue this conversation and delve into more depth, but also expand on ideas and reflections that have emerged through listening to each other's interviews. Perhaps we can start with you, Maisa.
Thank you, Josephine, and I'm very glad to be here with you and with you, Nina, Alexandra. Very nice to meet you also, Henry. Listening to Alexandra and Nina's conversations, one of the main issues I think that was brought, and maybe that is an intersection, is to whom is the priority given in relation to the different policies we are having, whether in relation to governance of borders, housing policies, regulations in relation to sex work, and so on. And it seems that the priority is almost always given to the state, to the nation states. Principles, values, objectives, whatever it is, rather than the migrant. And I think this is inherently related to the nation state that is around citizenship and the natives. These are the people the nation state is considered to be responsible of. These are also the voters who are important and who put people in power, keep them in power. And this is the whole thing, I think, in relation to migrants being in the margins, in relation to policies, in relation to practices, services, etc., etc., because they are not the priority of the nation state. Even though in relation to refugees, for example, one of the main reasons for some of the countries that they were quite flexible, and I put it really in between brackets, was this idea of the refugee dividend that Hansen, who's a political scientist in Linköping, wrote about in his book that was published a few months ago, which was this idea of having an investment because there is a labor shortage, because there is aging society. And he speaks about this concept of a triple win that was actually explicitly said in AU parliament discussions, saying that we can actually have a triple win. We get solutions to these two problems and we protect people. But that's the third thing. It's not the priority. It's not the main thing. So I think, like, with lives actually of migrants being really on the margins, issues of their health, of their well-being and their belongings are even on the margin of the margins. Like, what would be important actually if we care of them is them as a labor force, them as paying back for the dividend, but speaking about their well-being, their belonging, how they feel, I think that's like the margins of the margins, and that's the issue we face, and the frustration that I felt in all of us and everyone who's usually researching this kind of issues from a standing point that is different than just, because there is also a lot of migration research that is done to pinpoint problems that migrants pose or whatever. So maybe that's a first thought that we can discuss a little bit, and the impossibility that people face in relation to that, being on the margin, the impossibility to have a stable life, to be able to work and pay back this dividend and contribute and build a life, the impossibility to transit to something else. And I think Nina spoke about that, and this temporality, and even when people want to transition to another type of work, it is very difficult because of all the policies in relation to that. So I will stop here for starting.
Fantastic. Thank you, Maisa. Absolutely raising some important points. Do we want to continue? Alexandra, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you. I'm very much in sync with you, Maisa, and I would like to take like two kind of like side tracks from your starting point. The first one has to do with the kind of like thinking post the nation state, and at least in my research, that there is such a collision of different levels of governance, and then it isn't so clear who is actual the state. Is it the European Union? Is it the nation state? What is the role of the local actors? And all of that translates to to a lot more hierarchies add to that, and this makes different kinds of studies around the living experiences of people trying to cross borders, or people trying to gain international protection, or people that they're involved in sex work, etc., even more complicated. And to give an example, then, if we're talking about the European asylum regime at the borders, uh, I wouldn't say that the way that it is implemented is prioritizing the Greek citizen or even the Greek nation state. And it becomes also very interesting how any then solidarity movements that could try to bring up this idea that, you know what, we are all kind of used here. Either we are locals or refugees or migrants, and there is this kind of like different kinds of layers of interests, which in any case just push us further and further to the margins, um, were really shut down, like violently shut down. Um, while the European Union is paying a lot of money to develop the civil society in these other countries far away that they really needed to democratize, and I'm very ironic in all of that. At the same time, um, civil society at the borders of the European Union is really shut down. And I would also think in relation to what you said, not necessarily who is the priority, but also it becomes so incredibly difficult to understand what is the aim and the scope of the policies. Sometimes, and listening to both of you, I'm thinking that this production of the complete opposite effects of the intended on the paper, at some point you're like, is it even intentional? It goes beyond like some sort of mainstream political science inquiry of, oh, why do these policies around like sex work fail, and we cannot actually improve the protection of the rights of the people involved in sex work? Or, I mean, like, how can we provide mental health services and address people's needs in relation to mental health? So, I mean, this is, I think, my more questions than answers, I'm afraid.
Absolutely. Definitely raises several points also, kind of on what are the points and who wants those points addressed, because regardless of what the target is, if it's coming from above, it might not be what the target is needed from below, which very much comes out in all three of your talks. Nina, do you have some reflections that you want to add?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the great openings. And it was really a pleasure to listen or learn more about your work and listen to you talk about your research. I think it was interesting. I think it was interesting that that you, Alexander, raised this kind of humanitarian paradox in your comment just now. And I think that kind of relates to all of our research in a way, that there are these kind of humanitarian ideals and good purposes and discourses and public talk, but what often happens then underneath this kind of humanitarian aura, and how marginalized populations easily get kind of governed under name of caring and protection, and this is especially kind of relevant to my work with migrant sex workers, but I think also kind of thinking about situations in Greece and like all these new policies that EU implements in the name of kind of saving refugees from smugglers and so on. And I don't know how this would speak to also, Maisa, your work for this kind of therapy counseling. It would be interesting to hear kind of like, in your talk, you said that the users were generally very happy to find this space where they could talk about their trauma and kind of be as they are. And I think one important thing that you raised there was kind of this accidental community making, which was not about the institution making these support networks, but actually that these spaces just became places where you could actually connect with similar experiences. And this was also something very important in my work, and the fact that Sweden doesn't provide these low threshold services for sex workers where people could just gather had led to massive isolation. Like some of the interviewees I talked had never talked about sex work with anybody before they talked to me, which was quite shocking, thinking that it's part of their everyday experience and there's so much stigma, and also not being able to deal with things related to your labor and so on. And also what rose in the interviews then was the importance of having that community, and how sex workers themselves, kind of their first political goal in Sweden was to create this community rather than be political actors outside, but to first kind of empower the members within, which I thought it was very beautiful and also politically savvy, kind of just providing this place to be and to talk. And maybe this relates to the third point I would like to raise, which is kind of related to what you were talking about, the nation state and kind of nation state as a kind of naturalized community. And I think this is especially strong in the Nordic countries. Like the civil society is often equated with the state. So there's very little, for example, social services or support networks created outside the state, and every time there's a social problem, like everybody's crying that the state needs to do something, instead of yourself organizing and trying to create these communities of support, which, for example, like I spent some time in the US, and there maybe kind of the violent practices of state towards people of color and other minorities are more visible, and this reliance on the state is that people are much more hesitant to that. And I think in the Nordic context, there's the important thing, how this reliance on state affects the service production and also community making when it comes to people of color or other marginalized population, like sex workers, who are very stigmatized in Sweden, and what this should do to our politics and thinking about, like, for example, service provision and political organizing and so on. So I'll just throw these to you, so hope we can continue conversation on these topics.
Fantastic. Yes, this brings us to the point of Scandinavian exceptionalism, which ended up being something that emerged so strongly in all of your discussions, to the point where we put it in the title, even though it wasn't in the original call. So thank you so much, all of you, for both linking back to what was discussed and for raising additional points. Comments or thoughts on, shall we try to do another round and see and add to the conversation? And perhaps, Henry, if you have anything you would like to add, yes, please join.
You know, from non-European, from this part of the world, Canadian, who wants to be like the northern country, your welfare state is the ideal for the rest of us. But what I'm finding very interesting, if I understood what you were saying, if there is no state services, the community, the civil society in itself is need to organize in the absence of the state support. Did I understand correctly? When it comes to sexual workers and another community, did I understand how is correctly, or I'm totally misunderstood your point?
It is, if I'll take the lead, but you can of course add, all of you. It is more the point that civil society engagement is often integrated into state services. So, for example, state funding will be funneled down into services provided to sex workers, or services provided to undocumented migrants, or services provided to trauma therapy, and so on. So the civil society and NGO activities end up being integrated into the state framework somehow. But this again deviates a little bit from the discussion that Alexandra was also raising, which is perhaps that what is the state? Is that some kind of structure? Is that some kind of new structure that is developing in response to a problem, or is it fixing the problem on paper? Or so perhaps we can advance. But yes, we are finding that even though it is a target example for many places around the world, which is why I actually think that the happenstance that this ended up being very Nordic centric, I think is a good thing, because we are also platforming to an international community that the Scandinavian exceptionalism is perhaps not so exceptional. But let's continue the conversation, and we can add to it as we go. Does that sound okay, Henry? Yeah. Maisa, would you like to add something?
Yes, and I can maybe add on the same point about civil society and the state, and what Henry raised. I think one of the things beyond integration is also many times dependence in terms of funding. And for example, the therapy center where I have been doing my fieldwork is a non-profit, so it's part of civil society. But since its founding decades ago, it was in collaboration with the municipality, and actually the government was a main source of funding. And when this funding was cut, actually the services needed to be limited gradually, actually, to, I won't say disappear, but almost. So it's like it really downsized a lot when the priorities shifted and the state cut funding. And I think this is actually happening a lot in relation to organizations that depend heavily on funding from the government, which is much more frequent, I believe, in the Nordic countries than in other countries, where the relationship between state and civil society can be a little bit more conflictual usually than being more working. And then maybe going to the point that Nina raised in relation to humanitarian or caring governance in relation to that, and also this idea of intentionality that you brought, Alexandra. I actually would say that this is part of it, and there is for sure things that do not happen intentionally, and it's a lot of dysfunctioning in relation to how things are. But at the same time, we are now, in relation to migration particularly, witnessing a criminalization of humanitarian action. So a lot of humanitarian workers, especially people working in the borders and rescuing boats and so on, are facing criminal charges and so on and so forth. So I think in relation to migration, the humanitarian dimension is now moving to some resistant civil society actors. And it's not anymore about governmental or European governance that is humanitarian. Even if the argument is to get people, to save people from smugglers, the reality is that there is no other ways. Like, the logical solution to save people from smugglers is to allow people to apply for asylum, for example, from the embassies in the transit countries, so that they can, if they are in Turkey, they can go to the Swedish embassy and apply for asylum, or to have different ways that you can allow entry and so on. But what is happening, I think, sometimes is what Alexandra brought, is this paradox of the EU and different countries. I think that's kind of also a whole debate about who is the main actors there, trying to keep a face of being a human rights actor while working a little bit on the opposite of that many times. And I think in migration, like, it's not only migration that is criminalized, which is also the discourse a lot about undocumentedness, for example, that they are really portrayed as criminals. And people who need to be deported and need to go to undocumentedness is the same, but even criminalizing solidarity. So it's like we are even one step beyond it. And at the same time, maybe in relation, that's another point. So, but yeah, but that was, I think, an important point that you raised, Nina, in relation to the to the creation of the community. And maybe on that humanitarian part, I think some places and spaces, whether NGOs or centers and so on, do become these resistance spaces in which they have values that are different from the main values, where discourses are different and when people are perceived differently. And in relation to refugees and migrants, I think with this criminalization of migration, with this very big discourse on threat, on security, on the welfare state, etc., there was very little space for suffering of refugees. It was not allowed, it was not necessarily taken into consideration. There was no systematic trauma-sensitive services. On the contrary, asylum investigations are very re-traumatizing. A lot of services and bureaucracy in relation to employment agency integration programs are very re-traumatizing. And here I'm even using what therapists have been repeating again and again, because people sometimes come suffering much more from what they are going through after they got the asylum than what they have been through before. So I think what happens is that it's also very little spaces when suffering is allowed to be listened, to be heard, and to be acknowledged. And this is what happened in that therapy center. It was like a space that was kind of different, because people, even when they go to, like, I have stories of my interlocutors who suffered to get someone recognized that they needed to see a therapist. They were saying, I am, and people will just say, yeah, but that's the past. Now you are safe, just forget it. And they were faced with that by administrators, but also by physicians or by a person like in the primary healthcare center and so on. So it was a little bit of a difficult journey, even to be referred to a place where they can get this suffering recognized. Yeah, and I will keep here. I think I was too long.
No, it's perfect. Thank you. Anyone else want to add? Alexandra, go ahead.
I find it fascinating when I'm thinking that, for instance, to kind of like to relate to your research myself, when I'm thinking of that in Greece, once after the Turkey statement where people were supposed or are supposed to be returned to Turkey, as Turkey is recognized as a third safe country where people were, and in that part of that was that the islands in Greece would be this space where people are like, they would have a geographical restriction, so they wouldn't be allowed to continue to go to Athens or other parts of Greece while waiting for their asylum application or to apply for asylum besides this specific island where they landed. And we've seen that so much all over the world and all over the years, islands in relation to detention, in relation to governance of asylum. But what is really interesting in relation to what you say is that in the beginning, of course, there was an idea that there are certain people that they have some vulnerabilities that they need to be allowed to leave the island and go to the mainland and being able to seek for help. So there were different kinds of categories, and usually it's like more of what you would call the visible vulnerabilities. So in relation to being pregnant, having some sort of handicapcy or sickness, being extremely old, have a newborn baby, etc. And one of the vulnerabilities recognized was PTSD. And soon after, like not even like a year after this type of regulation was put in place, and I will not go to the nitty-gritty details of who was doing these assessments and how these assessments were used, and this whole like change of patterns in all the documents and the processes of these assessments, it's a discussion on its own. But at some point, the Association of the Greek Judges said that, you know, this PTSD, you have to remove it because you're making our work not manageable, because everyone who is a refugee, everyone crossing has PTSD. So what kind of this kind of like, how can we recognize this vulnerability or no vulnerability? And when someone says that, like, oh, you know, I'm actually vulnerable, although I was not recognized based on this on PTSD. And the state followed this suggestion by the Association of the Jews and said, yeah, since everyone has it, we remove it from the reasons why your geographical restriction can be lifted and thus you can move. And this is kind of like also to see how these different kind of needs or specific situations that people are also kind of sometimes dealt not only in relation to some sort of scientific assessment, but this idea of like, oh, since this is not manageable, we will just stop doing it, regardless of whether a physician or psychologist, a social worker would agree with that or not. How sustainable it is for people to stay in the horrible conditions on the islands while suffering from PTSD. And another issue that kind of like comes up, and it's I think another controversy, if we want to discuss further controversies, is what you say, the room for suffering is not there, and at the same time it's a precondition of deservingness. If you're not suffering, you're not a real refugee. I'm so tired of listening about the real refugees and the others, the fake ones, or I don't know, there's no real tag for those which are not the real refugees, but this kind of like emphasis of who, and I'm guessing, Nina, you must have encountered this kind of like idea of like, you know, the real victim of trafficking, the versus someone that is not a real victim. So no space for suffering, but at the same time to be kind of like deserving some sort of protection, we assume you're suffering.
Absolutely. And also, if your suffering is what is needed on paper to justify your, I mean, we shouldn't even call it belonging, but your right to exist in the context, then it is also what you are trying to amplify. And the more you amplify it, the more it's dismissed as fake, performed, and so on. Nina, I would love for you to add something. And I'm also thinking in relation to something that really stood out to me is the accidental community that you bring up, and how there's an irony in that. If we think about Alexandra's work, and this fascination in the Nordic context on social engineering, and how these type of accidental situations are often planned, and people try to implement them to various benefits. But I'm wondering if there's a dissonance in that, and if perhaps the communities created on paper to address a specific problem, and communities that take shape accidentally to relieve either suffering or an absence of belonging or an absence of well-being or an isolation or marginalization and so on, if there are substantial differences in those. And I'm thinking that if in your work, Nina, the organizations that were perhaps closer to state organizations, more considering the Nordic model as, you know, the sex worker as victim, versus those seeing sex workers as legitimate workers trying to make a living, and being agentic, whether they were very different or had a different approach, or if they just kind of just evolved as was in context. I'll leave it there.
Thank you all. Thank you, Josephine and Alexandra and myself. I'll maybe start about the hierarchies of deservingness, because I think that's something that comes afore in all of our work, and I think it's interesting that the suffering cannot show, but on the other hand, it needs to be a spectacle. Like, we need to witness the bodies, we need to witness the boats, like especially in related to sex work, like the sex trafficking narratives are full of like orifices and like violence, and like, you know, it's very made very much of a spectacle to create this moral outrage. But then on the personal level, people either it cannot show, or people need to kind of demonstrate that they deserve to be a victim. And especially in the sex work, I see kind of like this: you're either a victim or a criminal. So you're either this innocent, non-agential victim who has just been like abducted and violated. But if you have some sort of agency, you easily become faulty of the crime that has been made to you. And I find it especially difficult, this discourse of trafficking, because it's a very kind of narrow legal category that builds on a kind of this idea of innocence, maybe in a similar way that you, Alexandra, was talking about the real refugees, because we all know that migrants move of various reasons, and they're never usually only kind of the need for protection. It often mixes with economic and other reasons. So there's not kind of like pure, like I don't know, like this discussion of pure refugees is a bit limited of kind of like thinking about the multiplicity of people's desires and lives. But yeah, I just wanted to brought up this kind of hierarchies of deservingness and vulnerability, and how it kind of like also affects the rights to the state services and state access to the state, which in the Nordic countries is the main provider of rights and services. And I wanted to say another thing about the Scandinavian exceptionalism, especially for the international audience. You, Henry, asked about it, and I do agree that the Nordic welfare state is quite expansive, and living in the US, you can really see the differences in just everyday level well-being and safety and so on, because there's much less poverty and marginalization. So the services to some extent are really good. But I think something that migration scholars, especially and critical race scholars, have highlighted, that the access to the state is, it depends on your migration status, of course, but also kind of we can see that, for example, the education and unemployment levels, and Alexandra, you were talking also about access to housing, is very kind of conditioned on whether you were born in the state and whether you are passing as a white Nordic person. So I think these divides are very important to take into account. And I think when it comes to my topic, also sexuality becomes a very central divide, even if Sweden is traditionally seen as a very sexually liberated. Its laws towards sex work are very punitive, and for example, the state can take over the custody of sex workers' children, and you might get like into different kind of state normalizing processes if you don't fit to the normative, the framework of a normative citizen. And I think this also kind of is portrayed in discussions on integration and what does it mean to integrate as a migrant. Like, there's some sort of normative ideas of Swedishness that the state tries to direct you to, and they can sometimes be violent or coercive. About the accidental communities, and I think this is also something that I see relates partly to the state, and also some sort of like professionalization of NGOs and social organizing. So what I see is that often NGOs are not led by the communities. They're led by professionals who are trained in this area, and who can kind of like respond to the funders' demands and write certain kind of letters and applications and all these things. And I think this leads to certain type of bureaucratization of the civil society, and also kind of distances itself from the community, and easily becomes more aligned with the state. In my case of like sex work, so there the civil society against trafficking, so there isn't really kind of like civil society that would provide social and social and health services for sex workers, but the state social services directed to sex workers, the civil society that assist victims of trafficking and also do outreach work among people who sell sex, as well as the police and the policymakers, are all coming together in regular times, coordinating actions and so on. And so it's very kind of like centralized and organized, and like how could I say, I don't think it always brings the needs of the people who sell sex or who are trafficked to the center, especially thinking if police is one of the figures that is central there with policymakers and social service providers. So I think this kind of centralization and bureaucratization can be actually very dangerous, thinking about belonging and also kind of political inclusiveness of people who these policies concern.
Thank you so much, Nina. We have about 20 minutes left, and I'm wondering if we can bake it down to the minutia of the human experience, which is not so minor. But I want to bring it down up from the government and system and structure factors to, so what do we do, or what can we do, or is there anything to do for the individual in their everyday life? I mean, to belong, I think that there, to come back to what Maisa said, is like, how can you belong if you're excluded? And bringing back to Alexandra's point on when do you stop having to prove that you want to belong? Like, when are you no longer a migrant? And that brings me back, Henry, to what you were saying in the other session, which you've been in Canada for God knows how many years, and yet you're probably still not seen as Canadian. And the same goes for many of us who live in countries where we were not born and raised. But also linking back to you, Nina, a point that we left off in the conversation that I really would like to bring back was, can you only belong as long as you are needed? Which links back to what Maisa started this conversation with. And that's specifically relating to that, you know, sex workers could stay in the country as long as legal processes were in process, but as soon as they had finished the criminal cases, then people were deported. So if we think about the person and in their everyday life, what should we be doing is perhaps the best question, to revolutionize belonging, or to even bring it a speck of dignity. Not to sound completely disillusioned by our conversation, but I realized that we really started this whole conversation as this is something that's ongoing, when clearly it is something that is still out of reach for so many. Maisa, do you want to start?
I think this question is very difficult. And I think mainly it's because these two issues are very interrelated. And I think the governance level is actually what influences humans' experiences. And as soon as policies that are discriminatory, that are criminalizing some people doing all these hierarchies, not only policies, I think it's also ideologies, and it goes beyond policies. And that's, I think, the whole issue of the problem. And I spoke about white supremacy because I believe even if policies have been changing, the ideology behind has been very much about that. It's not only that, it is, even in white supremacy, there is all the hierarchization and people who are marginalized and people who are less deserving for different reasons. But I think within that, it's very hard to do small actions and think that these will change the experience of the people. We still can have an impact. And for me, actually, through my research, I have seen that few people can have an impact. That for some people who were very isolated, who were dealing with trauma, with suffering, with loss and grief, and having children who were still in war zones, and the family reunification applications were rejected. So they were going, it was not like, it's not something of the past, beyond even all the challenges they face. But they still managed to find a place that helped them in a way to go through that, because they found someone who was able to listen, because they found a place where it was possible to be yourself and to have someone who was, like I have an interlocutor who said that it was the place, the only place in Sweden since she arrived where she felt she was facing someone who was standing by her side and not against her. She said that wherever she went, usually she felt that she was investigated, doubted. This idea of like, do you deserve that or that? Do you deserve to have social services supporting you in that and that? And that was an only place where she was treated with dignity. And I think that's a very important thing that you bring, Josephine. And that's also the whole issue sometimes in humanitarian regimes, that it can make people lose their dignity. And I was actually reading a paper yesterday which was written by a Turkish journalist. Now I don't forget, like I forgot the name, but I can send it later if you're interested, who needed to escape Turkey because of authoritarian regime. And and while she worked as a journalist with refugees for a very long time, and she started her piece speak about this woman that she interviewed, like a Syrian woman in her 40s, coming with 2 children, who told her that, I wish I have died before I reached a time that I lost my dignity in that sense. And I think this is something that is very much in the center of it. When we think about whatever we do, how can we make sure that the dignity of the people we work with is at the center of what we do? And I will stop here and give the mic.
Thank you so much, Maisa. Are we going to continue in our usual round, or does anybody want to jump in voluntarily?
Well, I can continue because I had similar ideas that Maisa, and this really resonated me with this idea of respect and dignity, and especially like working with sex workers who are very stigmatized, like being met with respect and dignity was very central for experiences of belonging. And I think like you, Maisa, I think like, I don't know, like I'm just thinking like policies or services or like design of things. I think people who are most touched by these policies or services should be centered in the design and also provision of these services. So I think that would be something that, you know, getting rid of this kind of professionalization and trying to kind of really include the communities into the policies and services that are provided to them. And then I was thinking more broadly about like community making, and how kind of when we talk about migrants, there is this kind of assumption of the nation state as a national or natural community. And I think one way to counter that is to create different kind of communities. And I think in the housing example that you, Alexandra, brought, it was interesting that, you know, how it kind of revealed some sort of divisions in the national communities in a way that, you know, age groups, for example, don't mix, and how you can create different kind of belongings, like also like think about belonging intersectionally. And and I think one would be to kind of create communities that are not based on nationality, like create communities around us, around, for example, where we live, or around our workplaces, or I don't know, like other kind of communities that can resist this kind of idea of belonging that is kind of equal to the nation state. And in some way, like I don't know if big cities are that good of an example, but like at least my experience is living in big cities as a migrant and a foreigner, although I'm white and I have a lot of privileges when it comes to that. But that the national identity or accent or something hasn't been that meaningful, because the cities are kind of like ecosystems of their own, where the national community is not the first point of reference. So I'm not saying that these are spaces that doesn't have racism or exclusions or anything, but like it can kind of point to ways of having different kind of communalities and think how we could create them outside the nation state. But these are very kind of broad and maybe some way idealistic notions. But I think one of the main point, I think it's like, yeah, the respect and dignity and centering people who are most affected. I think these should be the ground of all kind of policies and service design. Thank you.
It speaks to participatory work and the need for that going forward. Absolutely. Henry, do you want to add something? Let's see.
Everything you're talking really resonate with and you know, as a social worker, I work with refugees. So we were trauma informed. We engaged in that process. But Maisha, you mentioned something. They want dignity. They want to be heard, but also institutions re-victimize their experience. You know, I don't know, when you say, you know, we want to be here, we want treatment, trauma-informed way of engaging, but then don't force me to be repeating my story over and over and over. Or the other component, to do not force me as a lawyer who go to the refugee meeting, that force my story to be restructured in a way that the lawyer can sell the story to the adjudicator who is going to determine my future in the country, isn't it? How you describe, all of you describe how institutions that are supposed to support you really aggravate the situation. And if you are reflecting forms of trauma, that become more aggravated. It resonates a lot where we talk, let alone, and you, Maisha, you mentioned immigration is criminalized. Whose immigration is criminalized? Okay, because it's not just a particular kind of criminalization. Intersectionality enter into that criminalization process. I find it very, it resonates a lot what you said. Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you, Henry. I can add a small point here, because I think that also in our work we see that there's a refusal to address an ongoing problem, because if the problem is ongoing, then we can't really land, we can't really integrate, we can't really, so when it comes to treating trauma, we say, well, an ongoing trauma can't be treated. We need you to land after your trauma. And at the same time, we are consistently traumatizing. So it ends up being this never-ending spiral. But for the last 5 minutes, I want to link back to the idea, which has been an ongoing conversation here at the university, thanks to Lisa Åkesson's project on post-migrant societies. And since, Alexandra, you actually brought that up in your talk, the idea of when can we stop being migrants? And you also brought up the issue that actually all of us, most of us here in this room, but absolutely all of us on the panel, are all migrants, work migrants, as we would call it, in the societies where we live, and yet it is never questioned in the same ways, even though, of course, it has also been questioned and is continuously questioned. I'm thinking here, brings back to Nina's comment on that if you don't look like the Scandinavian person, you will, I mean, people just assume that I am an asylum seeker because I am non-Swedish, you know. But yeah, so linking back to a dystopian or utopian future, depending on what we want to call it, where people no longer have to prove their belonging, and where societies are heterogeneous, which is where we are headed. So when is this no longer an exotic or problematized? Is that even possible? In 5 minutes, let's try to answer this. Alexandra, you are muted still.
Yes, I'm thinking actually the past few months through different examples at work and empirical evidence that we're having, and I'm debating very much in my head whether it could be some sort of solution to start having different kinds of like forming different kinds of societal needs and issues, not around refugee or migrant status or work migrant or asylum seeker, but rather the issues that they are societal issues. And I don't say that this comes without trade-offs, because it is true that as a migrant, as a refugee, as an asylum seeker, you do have a specific positionality in the society and needs that need to be discussed and addressed and being called by their name. But I think that maybe also looking beyond that into also including other groups that have needs can create also wider solidarity and networks, and kind of like a belonging can also be built through that. If you are someone that is struggling and is long-term unemployed, regardless of your migrant status, you can align with someone that, for instance, is trying to get a job and is like having all this pressure even in the Swedish system has a lot of pressure, like when are you going to be part of the labor market, when are you going to, as Mrs. start to pay us back for protecting you. So I'm thinking, or with a housing shortage, like thinking that a young Swedish child, a kid that is 18, 19 and doesn't have parents that had saved a really big amount of money for them to buy their own apartment, has to wait in the queue for, like in the big cities, 5, 7, 8, 9 years, where you do what? Live with your parents? Like thinking about the wider alliances, and also that maybe also enables people to talk about their struggles, kind of like, maybe it helps also with dignity, I wonder. When you can express your needs without having to hold your little label of a migrant, of a refugee, of an asylum seeker, and still say, this is my need.
In a way, it speaks to getting on with life as life is, regardless of what your problem is, which is what most humans do, which links back to the human dignity, but also the essential human element that we were talking about in the end of almost all of our conversations here, I think. Any final words before we, Maisa?
Yeah, I can maybe build on what Alexandra said, which was also something, to be honest, in my activist involvement I have been trying to work on, this idea of building alliances with different groups of marginalized people, because the system is not only marginalizing migrants or refugees, it's also marginalizing people with disabilities, it's also marginalizing poorer people. It's marginalizing a lot of people. It's not very easy, I think, because sometimes it looks as if the interests are very different, and it's also, we need to keep in mind that it's also a lot of intersectionality, and the fact that a person is marginalized doesn't mean that they will necessarily have solidarity with other groups and so on and so forth. But I do believe that it's a way forward. And in a very utopian thing, I think the only way we will be able to really go beyond this idea of when do you stop being a migrant, and I will also add actually Henry's question in here, like who stops being a migrant when? That's also another question. I think we will need to abolish borders and to kind of reimagine the world in a different way, where maybe more communal living and localities but I really believe that the only way we will be able to go forward is to, abolish borders. That's to actually have alliances and build enough power and masses that we will, abolish borders and the capitalist system and the patriarchy. And I think we can bring them together and create a new world.
So it's as they say, it's as simple and as complicated as that. Nina, do you have any parting words before we round up?
I think Maisa's words were a good conclusion for the discussion. I could just only add, like Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, that we need to kind of change everything to be able to live in a more just world. And I think what Maisa was just saying kind of highlights that we need to tackle different forms of oppression together and see how they're connected.
Thank you so much, Nina, Maisa, and Alexandra, for your important and timely conversations. I think they link to many of the other social problems that are raised throughout this conference in various areas. I think they will absolutely link to the conversation and the panel on social problems and the global situation and war, of course, but also on the keynote panel that is starting in a few minutes, and how we just need to change everything about the way we do things, and that a lot of people are already doing that and already starting those processes. And I think that perhaps academia is slowly catching on in participatory research methods and in decolonial approaches to knowledge and so on. So in spite of the fact that belonging seems so far out of reach, we remain hopeful. And thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. We hope that this is used as teaching resources and that this conversation continues. Thank you so much.